Hello everyone, this is Ninja speaking. I must unfortunately announce at this time that this is not the secondary review of the Super Saiyan 3 Goku figure, or the second one that I picked up, and that's because the main review part of the footage has been corrupted at this point and is lost to us, meaning that you have unfortunately missed the joy of seeing a figure that was completely broken before we even got the box open. And what do I mean by broken in this case? Well, literally starting from the top, you could see me messing around with the shoulders a bit there, and that's because the butterfly joint, particularly on the right side of the figure, does not fit in properly. Why do I say that? That's because the upper torso of the whole figure, it was actually warped in a way that actually prevented the butterfly joints from moving, possibly squeezing the things a bit and causing the butterfly joint to get warped. What other problems could that cause, you might ask? Well, the ab crunch in this case also got warped a bit, and is pretty much a little loose if anything. It's a little undersized. Maybe not warped, but it's definitely been casted wrong, so it's not working as it's supposed to, meaning it can't support the upper body and especially the weight of the hair. How else can this cause an issue later on? Well, not so much more on the lower part, but the lower part has its own issues, conveniently also on the right side. Namely the right hip joint, that is, in this case, actually using authentic joints in this case, as you can see here. Unfortunately, authentic does not mean functional, I'm afraid, because not only on the right side hip was the joint actually completely frozen, unable to move, it's also separating down the middle, and at the bottom bit, as I learned when I was trying to remove it, actually kind of broke on the peg there. So yeah, that's another issue that came up, and of course, last but not least, because why not at this point, as you can see, the entire bottom of the foot is missing there. Fortunately, it was actually in the box itself, but somehow it was either separated or never firmly attached. So that's another issue, but mind you, it's one of the more minor issues that this particular figure had. And last but not least, because I forgot to mention it, the faceplates, much like the original review, also don't fit in this case. But on the bright side, it does have that side-glancing face that was missing in my original bootleg, so I guess that's something. Just to get it out there, most of this particular video will be trying to fix this particular toy, but we'll also be looking at what is now a custom Gohan for me at this point, as well as one little last round of fixes for the Super Saiyan God Goku, because that also needed a little bit of an update, which I'll explain once we get there. Now, we're going to start with one of the more obvious breakages in this case, and that's going to be the hip joint here. Now, the first issue, as you can see plain as day, the actual thing that connected the hip to the leg is completely sheared off. That peg just completely broke off. And the second issue, once we split apart the hip joint entirely, is that it's really the pin that is jammed up in this case, which only inserts one way, as I found out. And that the way it got inserted was done so poorly that it completely froze up the joint, and you have to actually exert a lot of force in order to get it to move, which only by literally having my hands all over it in this case manages to be possible. If you have it properly in the figure itself, it's not going to happen. So in order to address this, first we need to glue the peg back to the bottom of it, which is a little easier said than done because there's not a lot of surface space. And the second issue is we need to find a way to loosen the peg, either by finding a way to get it pulled out, or to just kind of get it reinserted back into place or realigned. As it turns out, my embroidery gun back there, which is basically a glorified heat gun for hobbyists, actually managed to loosen the joint enough in order to get it moving again. I kind of figured that what happened there in this case was that it actually kind of melted some material that it was stuck with the pin itself enough in order to get it to really bend back into place, and now it is a much more mobile joint, moving it's supposed to. It may be a little loose, but that's not a huge issue. It'll still hold in its position. And also, while I was using that, I also took it over the shoulder that had the issues with things still consistently popping out, and I heated up that butterfly joint enough that the opening was able to become flexible enough for me to fit the shoulder back in there. It's a bit of a snug fit in this case, but it's better to have it a snug fit than not fitting in there whatsoever. And of course, this also means that I don't have to worry about that thing popping out on its own anymore. So at least that's a bonus. We're a few steps in the way already. Now for the next few sets of the repair process here, we're actually going to need to start pulling out some super glues in order to do the job. And despite what the label says on there, because it's weird that they have a different thing, these are all Bob Smith Industry based products in this case. The Maxi-Cure in the background is basically kind of an industrial strength glue, and the accelerator you see in the brown bottle there is basically just to take what already dries in a fairly quick amount of time, like 10-25 seconds, and actually it's a kicker that makes it dry even faster than that. So what you're going to see me do in this case for both the foot, which is the first thing I'm going to fix, as well as the hip joint, which we're going to go after, is I'm going to apply some glue on one end, and on the other side is where I kind of sprayed on the accelerator. Now, what I want to mention about the accelerator in this case is it does have some more notable fumes than the glue in this case. It's actually rather unpleasant, a bit of a bitter smell. So when you use this stuff on here, you want to make sure you have this in a nice open area when you're doing it, or have a window open and something blowing it out there, as well as you want to kind of wipe off any extra that you don't need for the accelerator. Really apply it only to one side, I find works best. And once you make sure you put your thing in there, or in this case the foot, make sure your alignment is good the first time, because it's going to get stuck there. The thing will basically become rock hard and make a good solid bond almost right away. So just as I was talking about that, we're already done here for the foot. It is, thankfully I got the alignment right in this case, and it's as good as new. At least on the bottom there, the sole of the shoe will not be falling off anymore. It's going to be stuck there now, which is good because that means that part of the repair is done. So we're going to move into now the more complicated item that I need to glue here, which is the broken peg. So as I was mentioning earlier, or at least I think I mentioned earlier, the main issue here is that the peg itself completely sheared off the bottom while I was trying to remove it, and it was already partially broken there. And as it turns out, it really only attached to one side of the shell in this case. So since it has a clean enough break that I should be able to reattach it, what we're going to do is take a little more of the accelerator, apply it to one side. I believe we're going to be doing this on the peg in this case, or at least I felt it was safer to do it on the peg rather than possibly get the accelerator on the joints. And if I accidentally get some extra super glue on the joints, then that would probably seize up all the work that I did earlier. So we're wiping off some of the extra, very unpleasant smell in the background, and kind of sending up the glue on the actual main part of the joint. Trying to keep it as carefully as I can on the section I want glued. I probably wanted more of a fine applicator on this for later, but at least it did the job for now. And I apologize this is being done off camera, but I wanted to very carefully line up the different cracks and breakages as much as possible. And I just needed to hold it on there for a few seconds, just making sure to keep it just in right place, at least until the glue fully settled, which thankfully didn't take very long at all. For a full 10-25 seconds, this would have been a nightmarish process, I believe. And lo and behold, even with just a very thin application, it's already got a very good hold on the plastic in this case. And as we can see, I did at least a reasonable enough job getting it back into place, and it fits in the original gap like it's supposed to. What I believe I did off camera on this one is I very carefully applied a little bit of an extra thin layer or two on top of where the original glue joint was on the inside, so it's not as visible, to really just make sure that the thing held in there just fine, and thankfully it's actually been holding up ever since. Give it a little tap for good measure to check. Yep, it's holding, but with the little bit I added later, it's holding that much better now. It's a good solid bit. It won't be as strong as the original by any means, but it's good enough to hold for basic poses. Alright, before we finish the assembly in this particular joint, there are a few things that need to be done. Namely one, I got a little bit of excess glue that kind of leaked out the bottom part there that needs to be cleaned up, as well as where the original pegs were, and not particularly fitting particularly well in this joint were. I need to sand those down so I have a little more of a space, or a little more of a texture for the next layer of glue that's going to help connect the joints more fully to really attach to. So first we're going to do a little bit of an extra opening also for the little bottom peg, because I noticed it wasn't quite flush, it wasn't really fitting, which might explain why the joint was not properly closing in the first place, so we're going to expand that a bit. And the other thing right afterwards is I'm going to be sanding down the original pegs where they were and are now busted at this point, in order to make sure that everything is as flush as possible, and once I push these together, they'll stay together flat. One quick test fit and glue later, the joint has now been reassembled in this case, and we'll be able to go back in the figure. So that's at least 2 complaints down, a few more to go. This particular bit of footage was shot a little bit later on during the nights in these cases as I was working this thing, and basically this is my attempt to fix the whole issue with the butterfly joints not moving, because as it turns out the upper torso was completely warped. How did I address that? Well, we took out our trusty embroidery gun again, and what I ended up doing for this is actually getting the whole thing roughly assembled together, at least as much as you can, and I reheated the whole thing and bent it back into shape. In order to get the butterfly joints to really fit through again, I also took a file, as you can see here, and I'm resanding everything to get it to open enough so that the butterfly joints can move more freely in this case. Unfortunately, this is about where I also make a mistake, namely, for the waist joint, which I was trying to fix in this case, off camera, I accidentally didn't let the glue dry enough, so it got jammed. And in my attempts to remove it with a glue remover, Bob Smith's Uncure, as it turns out, Bob Smith's Uncure will actually melt this kind of plastic. so the whole thing got jammed to hell and back. So now, in order to try to rectify things, unfortunately, I have to undo my own handiwork again, and I'm basically trying to recreate the waist joint. What I'm trying here is with a bit of a steel kind of a bar, which I'm going to cut the size. Technically, this could have worked, but it's also going to freeze the joint entirely in this case, which is why I would not recommend doing this unless it's a last-ditch effort, and I'm going to try to do an alternate plan on this later on. Now, before we go to the next bit of fixing in this case, what we're going to do is just admire this almost functional Goku in this case, because for the most part of the original complaints that I had here, most have been addressed here. So obviously the upper body is no longer as crooked, meaning that the shoulders are functional in this case, the butterfly joints will work as they're supposed to, the one arm is no longer falling apart at this point, no longer falling out of the shoulder, and the hip joint, which was originally previously locked on, is now moving as, or able to move as it's supposed to. So if it wasn't for that whole waist mishap, this actually would have been a very successful build and I could end the video here. Unfortunately, that didn't pan out. Let's continue. Now, stepping back to the original Goku figure, which has now become Gohan in progress here, what I did in order to fix this one is, starting off with the source of all the heartache, I managed to get the pin to come out of the original waist joint and basically just turn the joint the right way forward. So instead of being backwards like this, now it is the other way around and able to turn like it's supposed to. And this will be simply allowed to just push back in the original figure and it'll work as intended. Now here's the harder fix, which is actually the last real major issue I had with this figure, and that's replacing the missing joint that I ended up cutting off for no good reason. And in order to accomplish that, we take the same stainless steel peg you see me use earlier, and basically what I'm going to do is cut it down the sides, right up at the edge, and glue it in place. Now, you see me here with some Lapade super glue, which is meant mostly for plastic, but supposedly also works for metals. I find in this particular application, while it did do the job initially, it wasn't really as strong as a grip over time as I was hoping, so I ended up reusing some Bob Smith Industries glue in order to kind of redo the job later. However, at the time of this particular footage, as you can see, it's holding up nice enough. The figure is able to stand under its own weight again on the upper body, and for the most part, aside from obviously needing some touch-ups on the paint, especially on the skin tones to fix it, the figure became functional again, at least for a good display piece. Now, the reason you see me pointing at the knee there is because I actually took that originally from the Super Saiyan God Goku. I did a swap originally to get that thing up working, but I ended up switching them back because, as you can kind of guess with the new glue, I ended up fixing that knee again and was able to just return them to the original figures. I hope my next update video for both this and the other Goku will be with these figures being completed and properly patched up and painted at that point. Now, if you're wondering why we're looking at the Super Saiyan God Goku again, unfortunately, the original glue I used in the last repair video that this was for, the Revell contact glue for plastics, didn't end up holding for very long at all, in fact. It came glued on its own even without me tampering on it, so since it had been working so well so far, we ended up taking the Bob Smith Industries Maxi-Glue, and we're basically going to use that in order to really stick the joint back into place. Now, part of the reason it probably didn't work so well is because, as you can kind of tell, the whole joint is wobbly for that matter. It's an issue with the pin being too loose and just things being stretched out as a whole, I find. So in order to address that, we're basically going to use this, like a thin layer or two, and using, in this case, I'm using a toothpick to really help push the glue into the gap between the joints. And we're going to use the glue in order to introduce some friction and then reduce that gap as a whole. Now, the trick behind this, since as you can kind of notice this is a rather potent glue, even though there's a very big gap here, you still want to keep the joint really moving around as you have the glue starting to set. I'm not using an accelerator on this thing because I don't want it getting caught. And I'm going to just trim the video so you don't see me moving around this thing for like half a minute. But even after the first layer of glue, as you can tell, it's not perfect by any means because there was a very large gap, but it is holding much better on its own. It's taking a lot more time in order to lower due to its weight. So I basically added a second and I think a third little bit in order to get it to stay. And after that last layer, as you can see, the joint is now holding on its own. It's a much more successful joint. And in fact, it's actually stiffer than the other figure's joint whatsoever. Maybe a little too stiff, in fact. It was actually a little hard to move. And as you can see after that last layer, this joint is now a lot stiffer than it used to be. Definitely holds up under its own weight, and it is in fact stiffer than the other one whatsoever that didn't need any fixing. And all in all, I'm happy with the state of this particular toy now. And it's going to hold up on its own and look good in the collection again. So just to round off, we have one fully fixed bootleg on this one. The Gohan still needs some reassembly and touch-up paint, but otherwise we're about good to go, and well, we're going to have to do some more work for the Super Saiyan 3 Goku. But that's going to be on the next update video. So thanks for joining me, people. Hopefully we'll be doing a little more of this, and hopefully some more successes in the future, and I hope to catch you all later. For now, take care.